Hi guys, today we are going to go ahead and take a look at some techniques and psychology of false confessions. TED Talks that kind of explains things better than I can. Let's get right into it.
The justice system is designed so that you can act forth and confess to a crime. So in some cases, this could be appealing. Say that you are guilty of a crime and the evidence against you is overwhelming and you want to strike a deal, take a plea, and kind of get a better deal while taking responsibility and paying your debt to society. And actually, 95% of cases end with a plea deal. This may give some people a lot of confidence in our justice system. However, we have come to learn that this simply is not the case. Let's look at what the real story shows us.
About 50 years of psychological research offers a very different world of explanation. So you may know something about the wrongful conviction cases that have been emerging over the past decades. About 3/4 of those have involved eyewitnesses incorrectly identifying what turns out to be an innocent suspect.
Other common contributors to wrongful convictions, and we are going to take a look at one of them: false confessions, or coerced confessions. If you think about it, these are like a double injustice because it is not the person who is guilty who is in prison, but essentially another victim in the crime. And not only is that innocent person in jail, but that guilty person walks free amongst us.
An awful prospect for a civilized society to have to, bear the weight of. And the moral costs are added to by the financial costs. About $60,000 a year to incarcerate an inmate. Public assistance maybe for a family who's lost a wage earner, maybe millions of dollars if this leads to an exoneration and a lawsuit that might follow.
But why would somebody confess to something that they didn't do? Let's take, for example, a murder. Why would somebody do that? That seems just preposterous. Let's begin by taking a look at the interview room. Once you're in the interview room, you are in a place where you are actually presumed guilty. It is actually the job of the detective or interviewer to get you to confess. They're going to assume that you're not going to just confess easily. So use some methods and some tactics against you to get you to confess and get right in your face. They are not going to listen to your denials. They're going to cut you off when you're trying to say that I didn't do it. They're going to urge you to think about the consequences of continuing to not cooperate with the investigation. We're talking about an innocent person. You found yourself in this cold and very unfriendly, hostile environment. It's made to be very uncomfortable in there, and they will keep you in there for hours. In fact, the average duration that a person has been in an interview room for a coerced confession is 16 hours. You're probably hungry. You might need to use the bathroom. You're confused.
And then let's add one more layer on top of that. The police are actually allowed to bluff about the evidence that they have against you. So they may come in and say, we have your fingerprints at the scene, we have eyewitnesses who've named you or who've identified you, there's surveillance video, you failed the polygraph test. For you, this is a nightmare, right? You don't know how this could have happened, but here you are and they're saying that they have all this evidence. And so you might find yourself sort of weighing two possibilities. Roll the dice, go to court, maybe the jurors will believe them, find you guilty, maybe you'll get life, maybe worse. Or, maybe cut your losses in this horrible predicament you find yourself in. Maybe you can get a better, more merciful sentence, something, and you're weighing these two possibilities. It may turn out to be a rational decision, to choose to make a false confession in a case like that.
In Richard Allen's case, it wasn't even so serious as to admit to a murder. He didn't go that far. But say that 6 years later, investigators come up to you and they say, hey, we have you on camera at the trails on that day, and you were wearing jeans and a blue or black jacket, weren't you? We have you on camera. And so Richard Allen says, okay, like, I guess I was, because you guys have me on camera and that's what you're telling me. And so they say, okay, oh, okay, you were wearing that? Okay, so you admit that you were wearing this on that day on the bridge. And so do you see how this could easily get manipulated? Richard Allen didn't come up to the cops and tell him that that was what he was wearing in that initial contact he had with them, if there even was that initial contact in the way that it is described. But this was like 6 years later. I would like for any of you guys to tell me what you were wearing 6 years ago when you went for a hike. Like, come on. If the cops tell you we have a camera, a video image of you, and you were wearing a blue jacket and jeans, I mean, that sounds reasonable. I've seen tons. That's like standard Indiana dude dress code is like a duck canvas jacket and some jeans. And then he's like, maybe I was wearing a hat. If you guys are telling me you guys have me on camera wearing a hat, then why would he question them? Like, he's not going to remember exactly what he was wearing. That's crazy. And then that would explain why when they were asking for somebody to come forward that was wearing this outfit, that he didn't come forward, because he was unaware that that's what they're claiming he was wearing. But the whole time they're lying to him and they're trying to make him think that they know more than they do. He actually believes in the law enforcement and he didn't do anything wrong, so he trusts that what they're telling them is the truth. I mean, why would he not? They're the cops. Aren't they there to get the truth? Come forward from the very beginning to try to be helpful. So why would he stop being helpful at this point when he didn't do anything wrong, in my opinion? Because if he was guilty and he just was like, yeah, that's what I was wearing, like, seriously stupid. I'm having a hard time believing that that is the case.
You're well educated, you got good coping skills. Maybe you wouldn't fall prey to those tactics, but you know what? You probably wouldn't be likely to be in that interrogation room in the first place. So this is hypothetical for you. Let's talk about people it's not hypothetical for.
I'm just going to kind of sum up what she says about people who are more susceptible to taking advantage of in these situations, and of a lower IQ. Immigrants that don't necessarily speak English as their first language, and who have criminal records, obviously, and maybe they didn't do this crime, but they just have that already against them. Poor youth. If you're young, you're very much more susceptible to this. People that have mental health problems or who have addiction problems. So if you're in an interrogation room and fiending for drugs, a cigarette, whatever it is, you're more likely to confess to get out of that situation, being a mental health crisis. And these are things that are already going to be aggravating that condition. And so in order to get out of that interrogation room, after hours and hours and hours of them judging you over and over again, you're much more likely to just tell them whatever you think it is that they want to hear. Or they ask you who the person can be, and you feel like they're actually wanting you to guess, but really when you name a person, then that not only implicates that person, but also yourself. Other vulnerable population, and this is where I think Richard Allen would fall into, you are trusting that the system is going to work the way it's supposed to. So if they say, oh, we found a weapon and we're going to run ballistics on it, or we have DNA and we're going to run your DNA against that, they're more likely to confess to it and be like, oh, cool, they have that evidence. And so I'm just going to say this to get out of this very uncomfortable situation. And then they're going to run the DNA and they'll find out that I have nothing to do with it. They run the DNA, nothing comes back, or say that they were lying and they don't actually have any of that stuff. So there's nothing to exonerate you, and you just confessed to this evidence that you thought that they had, but they were lying to elicit a confession from you, and now you're really screwed. And in my opinion, exactly how they would question him. And I can tell you this because of one, the Keegan Klein transcript, where they're continuously asking him over and over again, and he's telling them he doesn't know who has that account, he doesn't know, and then finally he's like, I guess maybe it is my dad, because he's the only other person that would be at the house with it. And I don't think he's actually saying that it was his dad using it. He's just saying, I've already told you guys all I know. I don't know who else could be using it. Like, nobody else could be using it, but if you guys are saying it was coming from my house, the only other person that lives in my house would be my dad. But he clearly states that he doesn't think it was his dad. Honestly, the reason I question whether Rick Allen could possibly have done it or said all these things is because that just implies that law enforcement is completely incompetent. That it was somebody right from the beginning who said that he was right there. People you would look into. Family members and people that were at the trail that day. People in the search party too. Might as well look at them. Instead of going on a national campaign asking for tips when you haven't even checked out the tips you already have. Just honestly, I have very little faith in the law enforcement, and that's because they haven't earned it, in my opinion. There comes a point when you need to stop and question your law enforcement officials. And if I lived in Carroll County, I would be gravely concerned with the way that law enforcement deals with cases. I would be demanding a more open and transparent government.
Anybody in any of those categories being frightened, terrified to be in that interrogation room. And fear may lead to risk aversion, and risk aversion puts you at risk for making a false confession. Meanwhile, you can imagine what the interrogator, or how the interrogator is interpreting the fidgeting, the crying, the signs of nervousness that you're portraying, right? Those are not actually signs of guilt, but the interrogator might interpret them as that and get harsher with you. And the fact is that stressed people are more likely to confess, but that's the problem, right? These tactics lead to confession, and we can't know whether the confession is accurate or not. So let's get back to you. We had you be rational earlier. Let's put you in the position of someone like this, where you're terrified and all you want to do is get out, right? What is it that I'm going to have to do to have them let me go? And that puts you at risk as well, right? As the hours wear on, you get worn down. What becomes more salient to you is the room that you're in and how uncomfortable it is. And you become more likely to do what it takes to get out of there rather than think about the long-term consequences of relenting and saying that you did it. How about children? Children who are 1/3 of the false confession exoneration cases. Compared to adults, they're more deferential to authority figures, they're more emotionally volatile, they're poorer at risk perception, they are poorer at seeing the long-term consequences of their actions, which makes them very vulnerable. Anyone else? Yeah. People who believe in the criminal justice system. And remember I said before that the police can bluff about the evidence against. It may not be that gun, or they may get a DNA hit on someone else, and then they may decide that there were multiple perpetrators, and you're not off the hook. Your attorney, of course, is going to want to have protected you against all of this and had you not signed the confession in the first place. But you, as an innocent suspect who believes in the criminal justice system, you are likely to have waived your right to counsel and your right to silence. You are likely to have provided a very detailed alibi, explaining where you really were that day, not realizing that any discrepancy in details can be used to show that you're a liar. Okay, so think about where you are now. You've made your confession. This ship is starting to sail. Is there any way to turn it? Sure, you can retract your confession. You can request a trial. You now have quite damning evidence against you. You have your own words against you. And what you're facing now likely is more serious charges and more numerous charges against you. The opportunity that you may have for a favorable plea deal is now eroded because they have a stronger case against you. And then there's more sort of avalanching consequences of this. Your attorney may not work as hard as she otherwise would have, given that you've made this confession. And there is evidence for this in the exoneration cases. Eyewitnesses who find out that you've confessed are more likely to testify against you. Your own alibi witnesses who find out that you've confessed are less likely to testify for you. Forensic analysts who are looking, let's say, to match the fingerprint at the scene to whoever did it, once they find out that you've confessed, are more likely to make that false match to you. There's more. So think about jurors and judges who, when they see that you've retracted your confession, might consider that a shameless act of a horrible criminal. And it may be in part due to that judges are more likely to mete out harsher sentences in cases of false confession. And you certainly can't blame jurors who have been exposed only to that last moment of your interrogation, right? When the camera is finally turned on, and there you are talking in great detail with flat emotion about this horrible crime that you committed. The jurors don't get to see the hours of you protesting your innocence. They don't get to see the intimidating circumstances. They don't get to see all of the times that you had to go through those details before you got them down pat. And let's talk about those details. It turns out that in almost every single rape or murder false confession case, that confession had included details that only the perpetrator and the police would have known. How do you know about it? Because it came out during questions and during accusations throughout the interrogation. So they get woven into your confession, and you can imagine how damning that is when a juror hears those details coming out of your own mouth. So somehow, thankfully, we actually do have hundreds of exoneration cases involving false confessions. I don't want you thinking about those hundreds, though. I want you thinking about the likely tens of thousands of people currently in prison who've fallen prey to this. I want you to think about, as you're walking down the street, it could happen to him, and maybe the homeless guy who lives on the corner. We don't want any of these people going to prison for a murder that they didn't commit, and we certainly don't want to run into the actual perpetrator who went free because these guys went to prison. So here's what we know. This happens. People do confess to crimes that they didn't commit, even murder, and often in 1 in 4 of exoneration cases. That's why we need to know about this, because it's so prevalent and it's so perplexing. It's not a matter of, a few bad cops taking people into the back room and slapping them around until they make a confession. It's actually much more scary than that. This can happen in a justice system that consists of nothing but good people who want to do well, people who trust the system and each other and themselves. And so we need to be very clear that meaning well here is not the same as doing well. We can make improvements. And that's where easy ways to make some improvements, particularly with regard to false confessions. The whole interrogation. It's easy, it's not expensive, and it allows the judge and the jurors to look for potentially coercive circumstances, to see how a suspect's story changes over time, and to be able to evaluate the confession inside of a meaningful context.
Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you guys for watching. If you liked this, please like it, subscribe, share. See you next time. Bye.